Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and let's meet the Undertaker. Yeah! All right, have fun, guys. All right, so considering the way things have been going, I figured it was time to take a deep dive into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
That's Frankenstein.
Which only seems fitting because what is Mud City but my own personal Frankenstein's monster? You know, stitching together parts of the historical narrative to support a paradigm looking to demonstrate that some of the modern narratives directly affecting our lives today, and just about every conspiracy theory under the sun, could have been deliberately set in motion by agents of the Crown, right, and their various tendril organizations, including, but not exclusive to, scientific fraternities like these, with their efforts to create and legislate various forms of education through the use of publishing houses like Macmillan, who dominates the academic publishing world from the time of its inception to the present day. And unbelievably, Mary Shelley and her book Frankenstein may be the linchpins that charlies up a good portion of this story, not only because she wrote Frankenstein, but because her branch of the puzzle tree yields fruit that connects her to everything this season and this show is all about. Everything from how we came to be fragile fractals to how inoculations came to be modern medicine's cure-all. And I'm not even joking. Just about every aspect of Mary Shelley's life has ramifications in the modern world. And so like any other life, her life starts with her parents. Right? And so her parents were one William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. And so it's here with Mary Shelley, née Godwine's parents, that this whole thing charlies out. Because Mary had anything but a normal childhood. And so Mary Shelley's father, William Godwin, who I've been calling the Juice, right, he was a writer and political philosopher, an all-around well-connected guy, who was born on March 3rd, right, so we can get a 33 out of that, which is really amazing. But we're not going to start with the Juice. We're going to start with Mary's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. And so you know with a name like Wollstonecraft, this is where Falcon's Maze begins for her. And so I couldn't find a direct link to any ancient Anglo-Saxon or Norman nobility, like there was no Duke or Earl Wollstonecraft, but the name roughly translates to one who comes from the Wolfstone place, craft being a variation of croft, which just means a parcel of land, right? And a wolfstone is a large stone slab placed over graves to keep wolves from digging up and ravaging the remains of those buried beneath. I found this article in the Hartford Courant, and it was published on Halloween in 2010. And so it says that they found some of these wolf stones in an old Mystic cemetery. Of course, this happens in Mystic. And so the article states that when a young Israel Putnam climbed into the craggy den on a snowy afternoon in 1743 and killed the last wolf in Connecticut, colonists could breathe a sigh of relief. And how amazing is it that the man who killed the last wolf in Connecticut, his name was Israel. No more would they need to place huge slabs of stone over the burial sites of loved ones to prevent the wolves from digging up and scattering the remains. The wolf stones, as they were known, were eventually used as capstones for stone walls, were discarded, or became buried over time. And so Wollstonecraft could translate to one who comes from the cemetery, right? And that's really amazing because you know who comes from a cemetery? That's right, Frankenstein's monster comes from the cemetery. And so this just blows me away that Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's middle name could mean one who comes from the cemetery. And so, unfortunately, Mary Shelley never had the chance to talk about this with her mother, who died 11 days after giving birth to her gateway daughter. And this is too bad, really, because her mother's notoriety is both a blessing and a curse to Mary Shelley, and her story would probably be very different if she had known her mother. Because Mary's mother's story is crazy right from Jump Street, and that begins with her birthplace, right? Spitalfields, England. And here's Spitalfields today. And so I don't know if you recognize this chapel in the background here, but this is the White Chapel of Jack the Ripper fame. 2 of his 5 conical murders took place in Spitalfields. First, there was Annie Chapman, who was killed on Hanbury Street. And amazingly enough, Annie Chapman lived on Dorset Street, which is really incredible for a host of reasons, the way that Dorset factors into the Mud City paradigm. And one of those reasons is that the other Spitalfields murder takes place on Dorset Street. Mary Jane Kelly is murdered on Dorset Street. And of course, it's the most gruesome of Jack the Ripper's murders, and this is allegedly a photograph of her mutilated body. And so not only is Spitalfields home to some Jack the Ripper action, Mary Wollstonecraft is from there. And I'm sure this is just a circumstantial coincidence, but what a connection to make. And maybe even more incredible than this is what the word Spitalfield means. When I was looking into the Wolfstones and read that the last wolf in Connecticut had been killed in 1743, I wanted to find out what the wolf situation was like in jolly old England, right? And wolves were a real problem for the Britons. It was always wolf season in England until they were hunted to extinction during the reign of Henry VII. So we're looking at sometime in the late 1400s or early 1500s. And so never ceasing to pop up in surprising places, Sherwood Forest was a killing field for wolves. Sir Robert Plumpton held a bovate of land called Wolf Hunt Land in Nottingham. And so essentially what they would do is they would frighten the wolves into a clearing and slaughter them. Right, this is really incredible. Sherwood Forest never ceases to amaze. Right? And so up north in Scotland, the last wolf was killed in 1680, and the unicorns rejoiced. And the wolf problem was so bad in Scotland that during the reign of James VI, future king of a unified Scotland and England, and good chums with Lord Baltimore and Lenny Poe, right, during his time, he builds safe houses along highways for protection from wolf attacks called Spittals, which is also an abbreviation for hospital, which is allegedly how Spitalfields gets its name. There was a hospital there. And Spittals were hospitals especially for those with contagious diseases. So this means that Mary from the Wolfstone place was born in a neighborhood whose name could translate to Fields of the Wolf Safe Houses. Right? This is really amazing. Right? And to top it off, Spitalfields is located on a Roman burial ground, right, which was first noticed by antiquarian John Stowe in 1576, and it was excavated in the 90s, where they found this woman who was buried at the tail end of the Roman occupation, and they found her buried in a lead coffin inside a limestone sarcophagus. So if they were using lead coffins in limestone sarcophagi, they most certainly were using wolfstones. And this could reinforce the one who comes from the cemetery meaning of Wollstonecraft. And it could also make the Wollstonecraft name a very ancient name that roughly translates in the modern vernacular to Undertaker. All of this just from her name. And so if her name is that incredible, let's get into the person, this wolf in sheep's clothing, because Mary Wollstonecraft was nothing if not a socio-political animal. In fact, she may have been the first modern feminist. Right, today, Wollstonecraft is regarded as one of the founding feminist philosophers. And her most influential book was called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, with strictures on political and moral subjects. And it was published in 1792. And in this book, she argues that women are not naturally inferior to men, but appear to be only because they lack education. Fair enough, but with all such philosophies, it's not so much the philosophy itself as it is how you use that philosophy. And the Undertaker didn't come up with these ideas in a vacuum. Mary Wollstonecraft was very taken in by what was happening in France, where political equity among the sexes was a major component of the French Revolution. And so Mary goes to France in late 1792, where she runs afoul of the bloodthirsty Jacobins, which is really ironic because the Jacobins had a club of their very own, right? The club hopping never ends in the nonstop party that is Mud City. And their club is called the Society of Friends of the Constitution. The Society of Friends. Where have I heard that before? Oh, that's right. That's what the Quakers call themselves. And I'm sure that's just a coincidence, right? But the Jacobins, aside from being responsible for much of the civil unrest in France that leads to the revolution and to Marie Tussaud staging the executions of her friends, and the Jacobin Club had an offshoot group called the Fraternal Society of Patriots of Both Sexes. Right, so here we have the word patriot again. And the Fraternal Society of Patriots of Both Sexes, Defenders of the Constitution, was a French revolutionary organization notable in the history of feminism as an early example of active participation of women in politics. And this is allegedly where they met. And how such a feminist society is called fraternal is beyond me, but there's the irony. All this equal rights stuff is going on, and she finds herself on the outside looking in. And she's absolutely miserable in France because she's essentially held prisoner, unable to leave for some 3 years due to France closing its borders against the English, right? And more on her time in France later. But it's clear that the ideas of the radical French revolutionaries, Jacobin or not, either echoed or influenced, or both, her feminist philosophies, which she had just begun publishing a few years before, with titles like A Vindication of the Rights of Men, which was published in 1790, and A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was published in 1792. And combined, they sort of make her early magnum opus of feminist philosophies. And up until about this point, she appears to have lived a life congruent with her writings. So let's get into her life a little bit, right? We already know that she was born in Spitalfields and everything that means. And her life starts off well enough. Her family isn't poor by any stretch, but her father devolves into a degenerate, abusive drunk. And Mary becomes very protective of her mother and younger siblings at this point. And in an incredible sidebar, Mary's older brother Edward, down here, who for reasons unknown was born in Ballyshannon, County Donegal, and that's not the first time we've come across the County Donegal, but his son and namesake Edward, so Mary Wollstonecraft's nephew, is one of the most important people in the early history of Sydney, Australia, where in the 1820s he was director of the Bank of New South Wales and the Bank of Australia, along with being chairman of the Chamber of Commerce. This is a very critical time in the establishment of the Australian colonies, and it makes me wonder if any of those Aussie mudflood channels have connected the recovery of Australia to the Wollstonecrafts. But regardless, I'm digressing here because there are more sidebars to get to. Like when Mary was a young girl, she develops a deep friendship with one of her teacher's daughters, one Jane Arden, whose married name was Gardner. And in her adult life, Jane Gardner was a live-in tutor and nanny to some very wealthy dukes and earls and whatnot, and she ran her own school for over 30 years, during which time she publishes Young Ladies' Grammar, an unusual grammar that used French as a model for English grammar. And that's pretty incredible, right? And this is interesting because it connects her to the formation of the modern English language, at least as we write it down today. And this relationship that the Undertaker has with Jane Gardner, née Arden, has a deep impact on Mary's life. And she writes to Jane that the friendship and affection she feels for her is comparable to romantic love, and how she wishes that she could have Jane all to herself. But their friendship fizzles out in the years following Mary's move to Yorkshire, which happens when she's about 16 years old. And it's in Yorkshire that Mary will meet the woman who will change her life forever, when she's introduced to one Fanny Blood by her neighbor, Mr. Clare, a clergyman who encouraged her education. And how much do you love this name, Fanny Blood? I mean, how much more gothic can this episode get? And think about the multiple meanings and metaphors that can be culled from this name. I mean, it's really incredible. And Fanny is about 16 or 17 at this time as well. And the two girls develop a deep bond, one that borders on obsession for Mary. Her emotional attachment to Sweet Fanny is so fervent that it was the ruling passion of Mary's mind. And so I think it's fairly safe to conject that the two young women were lovers, whatever shape that love took. And the Undertaker made it no secret that Sweet Fanny was the one that opens her mind. And so by the mid-1780s, Mary and Fanny had opened and run two schools. And presumably it's during this time that Mary starts developing her feminist philosophies, such as they were, and working on what will be her first book, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, with reflections on female conduct and the more important duties of life. And this was published in 1787. And so I think it's very interesting that her first book is essentially a manual for how to raise girls, Programming 101. And so 2 years before this book is published, in 1785, tragedy strikes. While the Undertaker is busy living in the fantasy land of her feelings for Sweet Fanny, Fanny's feelings weren't quite as strong, I guess, and she takes a husband and is then stricken down by that wicked disease known as childbirth. And she dies on November 29th, right? So we get an 18 out of this, which is 3 6s, and then November, which is an 11. Right? So we get 3 6s and an 11. That's pretty amazing. So some very interesting numerology there. And the Undertaker was deeply affected by Blood's death, You think it affected her so much that she dies of the same affliction. But as devastating as the loss of her soulmate was, it was a watershed moment for The Undertaker, because with no Fanny to focus her energies on, she starts writing and publishing her feminist philosophies. And the bourgeoisie and the academic crowd eat this up, making The Undertaker quite the celebrity back in the day, proudly proclaiming her virginity and disdain for traditional relationships such as marriage. Her work and her public persona make her very popular, and things seem to be going great for Mary from the Wolfstone place. But then, in 1789, she meets this guy, Henry Fuseli, a Swiss painter who makes England his home because his art was well received there. And Henry is a very influential artist of the day, whose best-known work may be a wee bit of paint that he called The Nightmare. Look at this thing! And I'm sure you've seen this painting before, with its incubus sitting on this woman's stomach. And of course, The Nightmare, this horrifying black horse sticking his head through this curtain. This horse may be the scariest thing about this painting. And so I don't know if it was Henry's art or his sparkling personality that attracted Mary to him, but he has something that I like to call the bloom. She falls head over heels for this guy, and her hard stance on the emotional independence of women falls off like a prom dress at the feet of Henry Fuseli. And she pursues him relentlessly, even though he's married. And of course Henry doesn't mind all this attention, and the two regularly meet at the home of Henry's good friend, Joseph Johnson, who just so happens to be The Undertaker's publisher. Joseph Johnson publishes all of Mary Wollstonecraft's work. And we're going to put Joseph Johnson in our back pocket for later, because we're going to come back to him. And so The Undertaker and Fuseli play footsie for about 3 years, and by 1792, after Mary has published what now appears to be her blatantly hypocritical book, The Rights of Women, Mary's heart and loins have had all that they could take with Henry's games. And depending on the source, she either tries to move in with Henry and his wife, or offers up her chastity for a threesome with the couple. And Henry's wife is mortified by these proposals, whichever one is the more accurate. And I have to wonder, how is this not settled history? This is a fairly well-documented scandal. So who gets this wrong? But regardless, word gets out, and the Who Needs Men feminist philosopher is publicly humiliated. And it's here that she decides to go to Paris and reconnect with her inner feminist among the liberal thinkers staging the French Revolution. And as bad as it got for poor Mary over there, being forced to stay, witnessing the execution of some of her friends, and the feminism not being up to her personal snuff, things improve slightly for her when she meets American expat Gilbert Imlay, former military man who was sent abroad to sell Europeans, and the English for that matter, on settling the North American interior. And this is a few years before the Louisiana Purchase, so it makes me wonder if Gil here had any inside knowledge of what's to come. But regardless of the reason, he and The Undertaker meet, which is very fortuitous for Mary, because as a Brit, she could be arrested or worse at the time, because France and England were gearing up for war, and France had closed its borders to the English, so it was illegal for her to be there. And so whether it's true love or opportunity, she convinces Gil to let her register at the U.S. Embassy, where he works, as his wife, though the two never marry. But the illusion is apparently enough to save her any further troubles, because she now appears as an American citizen. And so apparently a virgin no more, the two have a child whom Mary names Fanny, in homage of her fallen soulmate, Fanny Blood. And so it turns out that Mary was right. Marriage wasn't what it was all cracked up to be. She is often left alone for long stretches of time to care for young Fanny by herself, because Gil was always off running some kind of mission for the U.S. government, either through the U.S. Embassy in Paris or by helping British agents get past French blockades. And Mary, for love or whatever her reasoning was, actually helps him on a mission or two with baby in tow. But it isn't enough for Gil. His adventurous lifestyle is way more appealing than life at home with the Undertaker and child. Right? And so he essentially just abandons them. And why not? It's not like they were really married, and so heartbroken and alone, Mary finally does make her way back to England, where she soon meets and falls in with the Juice, Mary Shelley's father. And so this is where I'm going to wrap this one up, but I'd like to close out with a few thoughts on how the Undertaker, Mary from the Wolfstone place, which in the singular could in fact mean grave, and make Wollstonecraft mean person from the grave, or a zombie. That's really kind of amazing. But what I really want to talk about is how she fits into the creation of the fragile fractals with her early feminist philosophies, which were perhaps best expressed in her Vindication series, Vindication of the Rights of Men and Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which she argues that men and women are morally and politically equal and deserve better than their current social standing. And so it's within these works that the idea of women's suffrage really starts to take shape. And it's an idea our friends at the Royal Society love, right? Because it's just the building block, the cornerstone they need for Project Fragile Fractals, especially the way that feminism blends so seamlessly into the LGBT LMNOP movement, right? And it's just amazing how this piece just sort of fell into place. Because one unbelievable element to this story is how emotionally unstable the gatekeepers make the Undertaker seem. You know, for someone who wrote so fervently about the independence for women, she comes off as very needy and high maintenance. She suffers from crippling bouts of depression, and in the end, doesn't come off as someone who practiced what she preached. She was not a very good role model for her feminist philosophies, which of course makes me wonder how she became such a figurehead for the feminist movement, given this contradiction. Unless, of course, they weren't her philosophies. As you know, in Mud City, these historical figures are either completely fictitious or they're stand-ins, given credit for things that they didn't do, public fronts for those that don't want to be known. And so with this bias, I think it's very interesting that The Rights of Men, her first feminist salvo, which was published in 1790, was so successful in its first press run that it sold out in 3 weeks. But it was published anonymously. Mary's name doesn't become attached to it until the second edition, making me think that our friends were just testing the waters with this pamphlet. And when the ideas went over well, they gave Mary the credit, providing a face for their future movement. I don't know, there's just something about this that seems fishy to me. And so I'm going to close this episode out with this last little cherry, and that's that my fat senses are all a-tingle around the fact that the Undertaker is introduced to her soulmate, Fanny Blood, by a clergyman named Clare. And we've talked about how significant the Clare name is in Mud City. Remember, the Clares were 2 of the 25 barons of the Runnymede, responsible for the Magna Carta, and a family that I speculate is one of the most likely families our dear Emily McKim owes her gold medal to. And the name Clare is also involved in the story of Pervy Mervyn Touché. Talk about a story meant to stoke the fragile fractals. Mervyn Touché is it. And so to close it out, could this clergyman Clare be related to the Barons de Clare, and perhaps maybe even to our Emily McKim? I doubt we'll ever know, but my fat senses are telling me it's so. All right, so that's it for this one. Stay tuned for the next libacious episode, where the mud will flow like wine. Remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies. Until the next one, cheers.